This webcast is focused on America 1920 to 1973, which is in Paper 1, Section A of your GCSE exam. Today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 4-mark question from the sequence that you have on the sources, the two interpretations that you face. This particular 4-mark question has the target focus of analysing interpretations and more specifically how they differ. So just to run through the key features of this particular type of question, the STEM, as you can see at the start there, is focused around how do they differ, and by they mean the sources themselves. What you want to try and do, as it says there, is identify at least two differences between the two interpretations that you've got. You can separate this into 2 paragraphs or just do it in one, but the idea is to try and identify specifically 2 differences. In doing that, try to provide a direct comparison between the 2 interpretations. So you should be trying to use that phrase there, whereas, to emphasise the differences between the 2 parts. You can use quotes from the actual sources, which might be useful as a way of specifically targeting 2 parts from the actual interpretation. But ensure that the comparisons relate to also the focus of the question, so whatever it might be, as we'll look at an example later. There's no need for own knowledge in this particular type of question. It's a fairly straightforward question, but do try and perhaps provide a little explanation of the difference. You'll see that when we look at the model example. And again, you want to try and complete this one within 5 minutes. So it's relatively short as a question. Don't overspend because there are higher tariff questions later on. So probably the best thing to do is to actually look at a particular example. And as you can see at the top here, we have the question, how does interpretation B differ from interpretation A? And then it gives you the focus of the question, as I mentioned to you, about women in the 1920s. So we're looking for differences between the 2 sources in terms of women in the 1920s. Now, because the first 3 sequence of questions are all surrounding these particular 2 interpretations, it's well worth reading both of them very carefully before you actually read the questions. So you can see here at the top they have a specific ascription, which is basically some information around the particular basis of the interpretation, and they have that again at the bottom here with interpretation B. Beneath that, you should see then the actual body of text, which is the interpretation's content. Now, this is particularly important for this type of question, this first question. What we want to do is we want to focus on this particular area, the content and how they differ, rather than the ascription. That will be something that will come up in the second question. So if we just remove those particular arrows there, because what we want to focus on is that content inside the box for this type of question. So if we start by looking at interpretation A, which is from Doris Fleischmann, published in 1932, and we look at the yellow boxed area, you can see that she says it was totally confusing to read the adverts in the magazines that showed vacuum cleaners, fridges and hundreds of other household devices which should lighten the jobs of women in the home. So the main thing she's saying is that for women it seemed to be that it was totally confusing. All of these household devices that were supposed to sort of lighten the jobs of women at home didn't seem to necessarily be the case. She goes on, women living on farms, so that's important, so she seems to be focusing on the farms itself, did a great deal of work besides caring for their children, washing clothes and cooking as they worked in the fields and looked after the animals. The largest group of American women were the families of labourers, miners, steel workers and unskilled workers. The wages of the men were generally so small that the women had to do extra work. So as well as doing this, the basic chores of caring for the children, they had to work a lot on the actual farms, working in the fields. And this was, according to Fleischmann anyway, the largest group of American women were these types of women that worked and also cared at home. Why did they have to do an awful lot of this work? Well, the suggestion is that wages of men were generally so small that it was up to the women to supplement the sort of income. So I suppose the overall impression then that you get from this particular interpretation is that life in the 1920s for women, which remember is the focus of the question, was relatively negative overall. Now that's important to bear in mind, because as you then turn your attention to interpretation B, if you think about the question, if interpretation A is going to give you a sort of a negative impression, I suppose you could conclude that potentially this one's going to give you a much more positive impression. Indeed, if we turn to Fitzgerald's accounts from the 1930s, you will see he goes on to suggest it was an age of miracles, an age of overindulgence. There was a generation of women who saw themselves as flappers, the wildest of all generations, deciding to take as much pleasure as they could. Eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die was their motto. Although their grandmothers didn't know it, these young women had discovered alcohol and jazz. So you can see here the impression is much more positive in terms of the 1920s and life for women. And although perhaps their grandmothers here perhaps didn't approve or didn't know about what was going on, in reality there was an awful lot of opportunity and also a rather carefree attitude towards life. So if we look at the two interpretations together, you can see that on the one hand we've got a rather negative interpretation offered by Fleischmann, and on Fitzgerald's sort of side we have a much more positive interpretation. Now that itself could be one difference, but what we want to do is perhaps try to be a little bit more specific in identifying the contrasts between the two. So probably the best thing to do then is to return to what you've highlighted, and I would suggest that when you start the exam you have a highlighter ready and are able to actually pinpoint the key things, which will make this next stage much easier. If you look at the first interpretation then by Fleischmann, you can see that we've said that there was a great deal of work, and we've highlighted that particular phrase there in the top box. Whereas in the bottom box there doesn't seem to be that sort of emphasis. In fact, this was a time when they had a lot of pleasure. That's not very clear there, but you can see the two highlightings there. So the idea that there was, in the one hand, a lot of work to do, whereas on the other hand there was a lot of pleasure to be had, seems to suggest that there's an obvious difference. Now you may remember that I said to you at the start with a key summary you need to have two key differences. So at this stage all we've done is really identify one key difference apart from the general difference between the two in terms of their attitude towards the 1920s. So just to make sure, what we want to do then is we want to identify another specific difference, and if you look at Fleischmann's account in interpretation A, you can see she suggests that the wages of men were generally so small that women had to do extra work. So there you can sort of imply that there wasn't an awful lot of opportunity to perhaps get hold of these additional devices that is sort of suggested in the first paragraph. In complete contrast, at the end of Fitzgerald's account, it suggested that young women had the access and therefore the money to the alcohol and the jazz clubs that were available. So there's two differences then highlighted which we can then emphasise in our answer. So if we then turn to an actual model answer and see how you might sort of structure that. Here you can see the question in full. It says, how does interpretation B, again with that key word there, differ from interpretation A about women in the 1920s? So there's your focus. Explain your answer using interpretation to A and B, and you can see here it's got 4 marks for this particular type of question, so we're looking at only 5 minutes. The clearest way to try and perhaps set this up is making sure that you are very direct with your actual answer. So you can see here it says straight away, interpretation B suggests that life for women was carefree in the 1920s. So there's sort of a general statement as to how life was going. But more specifically, it then goes into, it suggests they took as much pleasure as possible, eating, drinking and being merry, for tomorrow we die. So a direct quote from the actual source. Now here's the key phrase, whereas. You can see that in the centre there, it's been highlighted for you already. In interpretation A, it suggests the exact opposite, arguing that life was very difficult because they not only worked, but also needed to complete their domestic work, having little or no spare time. So no quote in this particular second section, but you can see there is a complete contrast between the attitude of life in the 1920s in interpretation A compared to interpretation B. There's a direct quote from one and sort of like an implied quote in the second part. Now, to get the full marks, all you need to do is make sure that you've got a second identified difference, and you can see this done relatively quickly in the second paragraph. We start off with that connective in addition to make it clear to the examiner we've got a second difference here. Interpretation A suggests that young women had discovered new temptations like alcohol and jazz, and again this doesn't actually quite quote the source, but those two phrases are there. Whereas, and there's that key phrase again, interpretation B suggests that all these new inventions caused confusion, and again we've got that reference to the word confusion there. So slightly shorter difference identified here, but still the key elements are interpretation A suggests some sort of quote, whereas interpretation B suggests, and again some sort of direct comparison. Now, as you've probably noticed, it's very important that you make sure that when you identify these differences, they're focused around the same sort of theme. So the first paragraph here, you'll have noticed, was all around the idea of work, and whereas interpretation A suggests there was a lot of work to be done both at home and also on the fields or in the mines or whatever it might have been, interpretation B suggests that work wasn't really something that they had to worry about, and it was a fairly carefree society. The second difference is more focused around new inventions and sort of life as a whole. One suggesting that alcohol and jazz were something that everyone had an opportunity and access to enjoy, whereas the other one suggesting that actually all of these new inventions caused confusion, so it's sort of the attitude to life and how it was changing. So try to make sure that when you are identifying differences, you're picking out differences focused around the same sort of theme, whether it be work, life, attitudes, whatever it might be. There is in effect no point in identifying differences when they're actually completely different things that you're actually identifying. Those of you that perhaps recall the apple tree analogy when you're identifying differences based around the colour or the amount of them being produced will remember that this is a key part of the difference question. So just to conclude, we'll return to this summary of what you've got to do for this type of question. It's the first question you'll face in paper 1 section A. So it's a fairly straightforward, they want to ease you into the exam, fairly straightforward 4-mark question. How do the two sources differ? You'll have seen that I've identified two differences. There is a sort of direct comparison using this phrase whereas, and trying to make sure that you've got interpretation A suggests, interpretation B suggests, and then perhaps using quotes, but if not quotes, then key phrases that you can see in the actual sources, making sure that you compare them based around the focus of the question, and that the differences, as I mentioned to you, are sort of related to one another. Don't just identify two things from the sources, they must be direct differences. As you can have seen from the previous example, there's no need for own knowledge, there's no need to sort of develop them, but you might want to provide perhaps some sort of explanation or context in terms of actually saying that something's positive whereas something's negative in the other interpretation. Try to complete the exam within 5 minutes and then move on to the next 4-mark question that you face, and that will be covered in another webcast.